In the far stretch of the galaxy where human outposts floated quietly beside alien territories, one shared base stood as a fragile symbol of peace. It was a place where tension lived just beneath the surface, and where silence often said more than words. Deep inside this outpost, a young human named Evan worked as an engineer. He wasn't a soldier nor a hero, he just fixed broken systems, kept power grids running, and made sure nobody got electrocuted by old cables that hadn't been updated. Since the war ended, Evan had never met a Valari up close before. Until today, he had only seen them in distant photos, tall beings with shimmering skin that shifted color like oil under sunlight. Their eyes were wide and luminous, like they could see time itself, and though they were allies now, most humans still looked at them with fear or caution. But Evan didn't have time for fear, because a malfunction had shut down half the medical bay, and someone needed help. He walked in through the half-open door and saw her sitting on the floor, one leg stretched out in front of her, and her face twisted in quiet pain. Her name badge read Lyra, and her silver skin had dulled around the knee where a deep bruise had spread. She didn't move much, just looked at him with wary eyes, not asking for help, but not turning him away either. Evan paused, unsure what to say. He wasn't a medic. He wasn't trained for this, but something about the way she clenched her jaw, hiding her discomfort, made him walk closer. He asked what happened, and she replied in a low, calm voice that she had fallen during a maintenance climb, slipped on an unstable panel, and landed wrong. Her leg took the hit, and Valari biology didn't react well to standard human meds. She had already refused the auto-injector, looked at the leg, then back at her, and said he could try something that wasn't medicine, just a technique he used back on Earth. When a teammate had pulled a muscle, sometimes pressure applied in the right way helped the pain go down and loosened the muscle. She didn't reply at first, and he thought she might say no, but then with a slow breath, she gave a small nod. Evan knelt beside her, unsure of where to begin. He had never touched a Valari before, and their anatomy wasn't in any of the training manuals, but pain was pain, and muscle was muscle. So he started gently working around the bruised area, feeling the strange softness of her skin, which shimmered faintly under his touch. Her leg twitched slightly, and she made a soft sound that wasn't quite a gasp or a growl, just something alien, something new. He paused, asking if she was okay. She didn't open her eyes, but said yes in a voice softer than before. Said that it felt strange, but not bad, and that no one had touched her like that before. Not since she was a hatchling. Evan didn't know how to respond to that, so he kept working, pressing slow, steady lines into the muscle, and watching as her breathing changed, becoming deeper, slower, more relaxed. Then something changed. Her skin shifted color, not in warning, but like a ripple of light moving through water. Her fingers curled slightly, and she whispered something in her own language, words he couldn't understand, but they sounded emotional, almost overwhelmed. He felt her body relax under his hands, but her expression was intense, like something inside her had awakened. Didn't want to stop, but didn't want to overstep either. So he slowed his hands, asked her again if she was sure this was okay, and she looked at him finally, eyes glowing in a way that made him freeze, not with fear, but with the weight of a moment that felt larger than both of them. And then, without warning, the lights above flickered. A sharp beep echoed through the bay, and a red alert signal pulsed across the walls. The peace of the moment shattered as Lyra sat up sharply, her body tense and alert. Her eyes scanned the room, and her voice dropped low and urgent as she said, "They're not supposed to be here." Evan's heart began to pound, not because of the alarm, but because of the look in her eyes. Something had shifted, not just in her muscles, not just in her, but in the air between them, and whatever was coming, it was no longer just about broken systems and bruised legs. It was something far more dangerous and deeply personal. The red glow of the emergency light kept flashing across the walls, while a low humming noise vibrated through the floor, and Evan could feel the tension in the room shifting from quiet discomfort to something sharp and alert as he stood frozen, trying to understand what was happening. Lyra moved quickly despite her injury. She pushed herself upright and reached for the communication panel, but it was Unresponsive, the system was locked, and her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from urgency as she turned. Evan, her voice lower and more serious than before, she said they needed to move now. Because this alert wasn't a test, and someone had triggered it manually from the outer hangars. Evan followed her out of the medbay, unsure of where they were going, but trusting the urgency in her movements. Corridors were empty and dark. The usual hum of machines was quieter now, replaced by that rising pulse of warning. Lyra didn't explain much, just said that someone was here who shouldn't be, and that this was not part of any scheduled activity. As they moved through the lower decks, she began to speak more, telling Evan that not all Velari agreed with the peace, that while their leaders had signed treaties, there were still factions who believed humans were dangerous, weak, and unworthy of alliance. She said that some of these extremists had begun targeting mixed outposts, like this one, planting sabotage missions to cause tension, hoping to restart conflict. Evan tried to process this as they moved through the maintenance corridor toward the surveillance hub. He asked why she would tell him this, why trust a human with such dangerous knowledge, and her answer was quiet but clear. She said that what he did in that medbay changed something in her, and that no Velari had ever shown that kind of vulnerability before, especially not to an outsider, and that maybe humans weren't what she had been taught. They reached the small surveillance hub near the east wing. Evan used his access code to override the lock. The door opened to reveal a dim room filled with inactive monitors and flickering screen. Systems had been tampered with, the internal feed was cut, and someone had disabled the motion sensors. Lyra moved toward the main console and tried to trace the source of the breach, her fingers moving across the screen with practiced ease. She found it, a ping from Dock 4, a signal not matching any known ID. A stealth ship had entered under false credentials and docked without authorization. Only minutes before the alert had sounded, and worse, the life signs aboard indicated a Velari signature masked beneath an old security code used by their military. Evan realized the risk they were facing. Someone had come in under the radar with access codes that only high-ranking Velari could have. Lyra leaned against the console for a moment, her legs still not fully recovered and her expression unreadable, but Evan could sense the conflict in her, her loyalty to her people pulling in one direction and her instincts pulling in another. He asked what they should do now, and her response came after a long pause. She said they needed to stop whoever it was before the sabotage began, because once the systems were taken down, the entire station could go dark and panic would spread. They left the hub and moved carefully through the engineering sector toward the outer hangars. Evan carried a small toolkit with a modified pulse wrench, the only thing he had resembling a weapon, and Lyra limped slightly but kept going, her resolve firm as ever. She explained that the Velari who might be behind this was likely someone trained in infiltration, and that this kind of mission wasn't random, it was strategic and personal. As they neared the hangar, Evan's heart raced. He had never been in a situation like this, not on Earth, not in training. This wasn't just about systems anymore, or diplomacy. This was about trust and survival, and about how far someone would go to stop peace from growing between species. They reached the heavy blast doors and found them partially open, a breach forced from inside. Someone had cut the emergency locks and slipped through. Unseen inside the hangar, the ship sat silently, dark and sleek, with no lights or movement. Lyra signaled for Evan to wait and moved forward, cautiously scanning the area. Then suddenly, from behind the vessel, a figure stepped out, tall, armored, and moving with deliberate menace. It was a Velari, but unlike Lyra, his posture was rigid and his expression cold. His eyes locked on her, and he spoke in their language, a sharp tone that sent a shiver through her spine. She responded firmly, standing her ground, but Evan couldn't understand their words, only their tones filled with accusation, anger, defiance. The male Velari gestured toward Evan, his voice rising, as if condemning her for what she had done, and Evan realized he was being blamed for her shift in loyalty, for the connection they had started to form. Lyra raised her hand slowly, trying to calm the situation, but the male didn't wait. He stepped forward with sudden aggression. And that's when Evan saw it, a small device in his hand blinking red. a disruption pulse capable of frying the entire station's core systems and bringing chaos to the fragile piece that held them all together. Without thinking, Evan stepped forward, raising his voice, telling him to stop, knowing full well he had no authority. No power, just the voice of a human who wasn't afraid, and maybe that was enough because for a moment, the attacker hesitated, just enough for Lyra to move. She surged forward despite the pain in her leg, and tackled him to the ground, her body twisting with strength. Evan had not seen before the device flew from his hand, skidding across the floor and landing near Evan, who grabbed it without hesitation and shut it down using his knowledge of Valari tech from countless system manuals and field repairs. Moment passed, but the damage had been done. Alarms blared louder. Backup would arrive soon, and the rogue Valari lay restrained. Between them, Lyra looked at Evan, breathless and wounded, but her eyes full of something powerful, not fear, not regret, but something that looked very close to hope. The tension in the air had not faded even after the rogue Valari was restrained on the ground between them, his breathing heavy and filled with rage while his eyes remained fixed on Lyra with a look that mixed betrayal and disbelief. Evan stood just a few steps away, still holding the disabled pulse device in his hands, his heart beating fast and his mind spinning with everything that had just happened. He had never thought a simple assignment to a shared outpost would lead him into a confrontation like this, and yet here he was standing beside someone who had been his enemy only months ago, and now felt like something else entirely. Lyra knelt down near the attacker, her movements slower now, the fight having taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady and firm. She asked why he had come, who sent him, and what he had hoped to gain. The rogue refused to answer at first. Then, after a long silence, he said the union between species was false, that humans were contaminating the Valari way of life, and that she, of all people, should have known better. His words struck something in Lyra, not anger, but something quieter and heavier, like the sting of an old wound reopening. Evan could sense it and wanted to say something to interrupt, but stopped himself. This was not his conversation to lead. It belonged to her and the world she came from. She finally stood again, her leg still hurting, but she didn't show it anymore. She turned to Evan and nodded that they needed to leave quickly before any reinforcements arrived, and before command locked down the area. Once security got involved, it would be out of their hands, and she wasn't ready to let that happen yet. Together they moved out of the hangar, leaving the rogue restrained and sending a silent alert to Central Control that the threat had been neutralized. They walked back through the corridor, not speaking for a while, both trying to make sense of what had just happened, the glow of emergency lights still flickering around them as the system tried to return to normal. Eventually, Lyra broke the silence, her voice softer this time, and she said she hadn't expected to face someone like that. Not here, not now, not after she had started believing peace was finally possible. Evan looked at her and saw how tired she was, not just from the fight, but from the weight of being pulled between two worlds, one that raised her to see humans as dangerous and one that now showed her something different, something fragile and real, and worth holding on to. He asked her if she regretted helping him, if she regretted trusting a human, and her answer came without hesitation. She said no, not once, not even for a second. They reached the medbay once again, this time quieter, with the systems slowly rebooting and the lights returning to their usual calm glow. Lyra sat down on the examination bench and let out a long breath, her leg clearly in worse condition now than before. Evan moved toward her without needing to ask for permission this time, and she didn't stop him. She simply nodded once and closed her eyes as he knelt down and began to work again on the muscles in her leg, using the same gentle method as before, his fingers finding the tight knots and tension and slowly pressing them away. This time, something was different. The silence between them didn't feel uncomfortable or heavy. It felt full, like something invisible had grown between them, something that couldn't be easily named or explained. Lyra's skin shifted again in that subtle way it did when her emotions were stirred, and her breathing became steady as she let herself sink into the strange comfort of his presence. Told him that what he did earlier with the device showed more than skill. It showed trust and courage. And that she had not known many Villari who would have done the same for a human. He smiled slightly and said he hadn't known he could do it either, and that maybe he had just been lucky. But she shook her head and said no, it wasn't luck, it was something else. After the massage, she leaned back and for the first time allowed herself to rest, not because her body demanded it, but because she felt safe. And Evan sat nearby watching over her, not as an engineer assigned to a station, but as someone who had unknowingly stepped into something far greater than protocol or mission. Details later, when command called them in for debriefing, they told the whole story: how they had discovered the unauthorized ship, how they confronted the attacker, and stopped a sabotage that could have destroyed trust between species. Again, officials commended their quick thinking and praised their cooperation, but beneath all the formal words, there was a subtle shift in how everyone looked at them. Something had changed, and it wasn't just on the record or in reports. It was in the way people from both species looked at Evan and Lyra. Like maybe this was the beginning of something new, a different kind of partnership, built not just on orders, but on something deeper, something earned in silence and pain and unexpected kindness. As they left the briefing room together, Evan glanced at her and asked what would happen next, and Lyra replied that she didn't know yet, but whatever it was, she wasn't walking away from it, and that she had a strange feeling that this was only the beginning. Following days moved slowly across the outpost as silence returned to the corridors and systems, hummed softly like they had never been disturbed. But for Evan, nothing felt the same anymore. He moved through his daily routines, repairing conduits, checking cooling systems, and updating interface panels. Yet every step carried the weight of something deeper, something personal that had settled inside him ever since that moment in the medbay when everything changed. He hadn't seen Lyra since the debriefing, though he had passed Villari officers in the halls who glanced his way with unfamiliar expressions, not hostile, not distant, but curious-like. They were slowly rethinking what they believed about humans, and maybe about him specifically. Evan kept wondering what Lyra was thinking, if she was healing, if she was still going over the events in her mind, or if she too was feeling this strange pause between before and after. One evening, while Evan was recalibrating a panel near the energy relay, he heard the soft sliding of the door behind him. And when he turned, he saw her standing there, her posture more relaxed than before, though her limp had not fully gone away. She looked at him without speaking at first, as if deciding whether to walk in or walk away. Then she stepped forward and said she needed to talk. They found an old observation room no longer used since the conflict had ended. The glass window stretched across one entire wall, offering a quiet view of the stars slowly drifting outside the station. It was a place meant for silence and reflection, and somehow it felt like the only place suitable for the conversation that followed. Lyra spoke with calm clarity, telling him that the higher councils had reviewed the incident and found the Villari saboteur guilty of multiple violations. She also explained that trust between species had slightly improved because of what happened, but alongside that came tension among her own people. Some believed she had crossed a line by allowing a human to touch her, especially in such a vulnerable way. Others believed she had done the right thing and shown that true unity was possible. Livin listened carefully, not interrupting, letting her say what she needed to say, and when she paused, he simply asked what she believed, not what the council said, or what her people thought, but what she truly felt deep down. Her answer came slower this time, but without hesitation. She said that for the first time in her life, she had felt something real, something not written in alliance treaties or political meetings, something that made her feel more alive than any victory or mission had ever done before. She said that when he touched her leg, it wasn't just about healing, it was about trust, and that trust had grown into something she couldn't easily define, but she didn't want to walk away from it. She didn't want to forget it like it was some passing event during a shift. She wanted to understand it, to see where it might lead, and she needed to know if he felt the same. Evan wasn't the kind of man who played with words or crafted poetic answers. He just told her the truth. He said that he had never expected to feel this way on an outpost halfway across the galaxy. He said that she made him see beyond species, beyond history, and that when he was around her, he forgot the lines drawn between them. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was peaceful. They sat side by side, looking out at the stars, and for a while, there were no alarms. No orders, no responsibilities, just the presence of something rare and honest. But peace never lasted long on a station shared between old enemies. The next morning, a message came through high clearance, confidential. It was a transfer order for Lyra. She was being recalled to her homeworld not for punishment, but for reassignment. Something that happened often in Valari military structures, except this time it didn't feel routine. It felt deliberate. Evan stared at the screen, wondering if she had seen it, yet wondering if she would go quietly or if she would fight it. But knowing her, he sensed she would not cause a scene. She would follow the order and vanish into duty, because that was what she had been trained to do, and it made his chest feel tight in a way he had never felt before. He rushed through the corridors, searching for her, asking other officers and checking sectors, until someone finally said she was in the transport bay, preparing for departure. He ran until his breath burned, and when he reached the bay, she was there standing alone near a small carrier ship, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softened the moment they met his. She told him she had received the order and would be leaving in one rotation, and that there was nothing to be done. It was an official command from her superiors. Evan asked if she wanted to go, and she didn't answer directly, only said that things were never simple for someone like her, that crossing lines came with consequences, and that sometimes understanding something didn't mean you could keep either. Stood there feeling helpless, wanting to pull her back into that observation room, to say more, to do something, anything that might make a difference. But he also knew that trying to change her mind with pressure wouldn't be real. He had to let her choose. He had to let her decide, not as a soldier, not as a Valari, but as someone who had finally seen the world through a different lens. She stepped forward, then not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel, and she said something he would never forget. She said that humans had always been described to her as loud, chaotic, and emotional. But in that quiet moment in the medbay, when his hands moved with care, not dominance, she saw something else, something powerful and gentle and impossible to ignore. Evan nodded, not needing to say anything more, because sometimes silence carried everything that words could not. And as she turned to walk toward the ship, he felt a shift again, not an ending, but the kind of pause that comes before something unknown. The station had never felt so quiet to Evan as it did that morning. The hall still echoed with the usual hum of machines. The distant chatter of crew voices floated softly through corridors, but for him everything sounded like it had been turned down to a low murmur, a distant background. He walked without direction, hands deep in his coat pockets, eyes watching the floor, and thoughts circling back to one thing: the empty space she had left behind. He had not slept much since the transfer. He had tried to keep himself busy, working longer shifts, avoiding the medbay, avoiding the observation room, and especially avoiding Dock 9, where her ship had departed 2 days ago. But no matter how many circuits he checked or panels he rewired, his mind kept drifting to the moment she walked away and the words she left behind. He kept hearing them over and over, that humans were loud and chaotic, but also something else, something the Valari never understood, something that stayed with her. Memory of her voice echoed in his head as he sat in the storage bay, where no one came during this hour, just him and a few crates and the soft flickering light above. He leaned his head back against the wall, letting out a slow breath, thinking maybe this was just how things were meant to be. Maybe some stories only lasted a moment. Maybe it had been foolish to believe something like that could exist between them, across cultures, across histories, across scars. Just then his personal terminal buzzed with a low chime, not a work order, not an alert, but a private encrypted message. It came from a non-standard source with no sender ID, and for a moment he hesitated, fingers hovering above the screen, before finally opening it. The message was short, simple, only one line of text, but it made his heart stop. I chose Earth, not orders. Meet me at Dock 9 now. He stared at the words, reading them again and again to make sure they were real before jumping to his feet and rushing out of the storage Bay heart-pounding footsteps echoing against the metal floors as he made his way down the corridor without stopping or thinking twice as he reached the docking area. The doors slid open, slowly revealing the large, quiet chamber where ships usually came and went, and standing near the far end, just beside a neutral transport vessel, was Lyra wearing a dark flight uniform, her legs still showing a slight limp, but her posture steady, her face calm, and her eyes filled with something he had not seen before. Not tension, not confusion, but decision. She stepped forward, slowly watching him approach, neither of them saying a word until he finally stopped in front of her, trying to speak but finding no voice, until she helped him with her quiet smile and a nod that said she understood everything already. She explained that after leaving, she had realized something deep within her had changed, that she could no longer pretend to be the same person who boarded that ship and followed the rules she had grown up with. She said that something inside her had been altered, not by war, not by politics, but by connection, by a moment of real contact and trust and warmth that no training or tradition could undo. She said she went back home only to find she no longer fit into the place she came from, not because they rejected her, but because she had already outgrown it. And when she thought about where she truly wanted to be, the only image that returned again and again was the one of Evan kneeling in the medbay, his hands working gently against her skin, and his voice asking her if she was okay, not because of orders, but because he cared. Evan listened quietly, letting her words sink into every part of him until she finally asked the question he had not dared to hope for. She asked if there was still a place for her here, if she chose this station, this world, this future, with him, not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as someone who wanted to belong. He stepped forward, then slowly, carefully, closing the space between them until they were no longer speaking across silence, but standing within it side by side. And when he finally spoke, it was simple and true. He said he never stopped hoping she would come back, and that she never needed to ask if there was space, because she had made that space the moment she let him in. They turned together toward the center of the docking chamber, where crew members watched from a distance, curious but not interrupting, and Lyra handed over her clearance papers saying she was requesting long-term transfer to Earth's Alliance branch, a position that would keep her close to the station and give her room to learn, grow, and decide where her path would lead from now on. Later that evening, they sat once again in the observation room, stars drifting outside like slow lanterns over black water, and for the first time in days, Evan felt the air return to his lungs. The silence between them felt whole and complete, and nothing about it needed explanation, because some things didn't need to be defined. They only needed to be felt. Lyra looked out into the void beyond the glass and said softly that her people had always feared change, feared sensation, feared that letting in something foreign would weaken what they were. But now she believed something else entirely, that allowing herself to feel had not weakened her, but strengthened her in ways no training could ever achieve. Evan nodded without speaking, knowing that nothing about this had been easy, but everything about it had been worth it, because sometimes the smallest gesture, a simple touch, a moment of trust could break through barriers thicker than steel and leave behind something no one expected. And in that quiet moment, with stars above and old fears behind, they sat together, not as human and Valari, not as engineer and scout, not as former enemies from two distant worlds, but simply as two souls who had found something real in the most unexpected of ways. The end.